All right, we're about to do something, well, a little crazy. We're going to tackle the entire epic history of India's great empires in just a few minutes.
I'm talking about more than 3,000 years of history. That's millennia of kings, countless conflicts, and an unbelievably rich culture, all packed into this short explainer.
And look, this isn't a simple story of one or two dynasties. Nope, we're talking about more than a dozen major empires that rose up, took control, and, well, eventually fell apart all across the subcontinent.
So, how in the world are we going to make sense of all that in just 5 minutes? Simple. We're going to focus on the core drama, the thing that defines every single one of these empires, the spectacular rise to power, and the inevitable, often pretty violent, fall. It's this relentless cycle of creation and destruction, over and over again.
Okay, so where does our story begin? Well, it all kicks off after Indo-Aryan groups settled in the north. This really set the stage for the very first great pan-Indian empire to rise up. And that empire? The Maurya Empire. It was founded by a guy named Chandragupta Maurya, but it really hit its peak under his grandson, Ashoka the Great. I mean, this guy's influence was so huge, his symbol, the Ashoka chakra, is literally at the center of India's flag today. But there's a twist in his story. After a particularly brutal conflict, the Kalinga War, he was so horrified by the bloodshed that he completely changed his ways, renounced violence, and embraced Buddhism.
So you might be asking, how did this great empire finally fall? Well, it's a classic story of betrayal. The last Mauryan king was assassinated by, wait for it, his own general, a man named Pushyamitra Shunga, who then immediately started his own dynasty. Talk about a brutal, but a pretty effective way to get a promotion, right?
Okay, let's fast forward a few centuries. A new classical period starts to emerge, and this one is all about incredible cultural and scientific achievements, and it's dominated by two powers that were super different, but equally influential.
First step in the north, you've got the Gupta Empire. You've probably heard of it. It's known as India's Golden Age. It was led by these fierce military strategists like Samudragupta. And because the empire was so stable, it became this hotbed for innovation. This was the era of giants, People like the astronomer Aryabhatta and the poet Kalidasa. And it was a time when these amazing universities were just flourishing.
Meanwhile, way down in the south, the Chola dynasty was doing something just astonishing. They managed to rule for over 1,500 years. Let that sink in. That's one of the longest ruling dynasties in world history. They were absolute masters of sea trade and built these temples that will just take your breath away. But here's the catch. They got so focused on these incredible cultural projects that they kind of forgot about their borders, leaving them wide open and vulnerable.
And that vulnerability, well, it brings us to a major turning point in our story. New forces started pouring in from the northwest. They first set up what's known as the Delhi Sultanate, and this in turn paved the way for one of the most powerful empires India had ever seen. Now, this period was just pure upheaval. I mean, under the Khilji dynasty, you had rulers like Alauddin Khilji launching these incredibly destructive campaigns. They raided temples and they burned the great library of Nalanda. Just think about that. 9 million manuscripts, gone, lost to the flames. It was a cultural catastrophe on a scale that's just hard to even imagine. But out of the ashes of that sultanate rose the mighty Mughal Empire. For more than 300 years, they were the power. From Babur's first big victory in 1526, all the way to the last emperor being exiled in 1857, the Mughals basically defined the subcontinent. They hit their peak under legendary emperors like Akbar, Shah Jahan, yep, the guy who built the Taj Mahal, and Aurangzeb, who pushed the empire's borders out further than ever before.
So what did the Mughals leave behind? A lot, actually. They brought gunpowder warfare to India on a massive scale. They set up the Zamindari system for collecting taxes through local landlords. And of course, they built these architectural marvels that still blow your mind today.
Oh, and yeah, they also gave us biryani. Can't forget that.
But like all empires, the Mughal Empire started to crack. And as it fractured, new Indian powers rose up to challenge them. This created this really messy, complex power vacuum, and it happened right at the very moment a totally new foreign player was showing up on the scene.
So, the 18th century, it was basically a geopolitical free-for-all. You had the Mughals' power fading, the Marathas were building this huge empire up from the Deccan Plateau, the Sikhs were consolidating their power in the Punjab, and all this time a trading company, the British East India Company, was just quietly,
very quietly expanding its influence from a few posts on the coast. So how did it all play out? Well, through a combination of really shrewd politics and frankly superior firepower, the British East India Company just systematically took down its rivals one by one. A company that started out just for trade had suddenly transformed into the final and in many ways the most powerful empire in India's long history. And the legacy of British rule, the Raj, wow, is it fiercely debated. It's really two sides of the same coin. On one side, you have this immense economic drain, absolutely horrific events like the Jallianwala Bagh massacre and the catastrophic partition of India. But on the other side, they left behind a massive railway system, modern education, democratic institutions, and they did abolish horrific practices like sati. It's a really complex and controversial inheritance, to say the least.
And that, of course, brings us to our final chapter, the end of all empires on Indian soil and the birth of a modern, independent nation.
This didn't happen overnight. It took decades of determined resistance, everything from nonviolent protest to armed struggle. It was led by iconic figures who managed to galvanize an entire nation. In the end, the mighty British Empire was brought to its knees by a call for freedom that was just unstoppable.
And then, on August 15, 1947, the moment finally came. The long imperial chapter of India's history was officially closed. And for the first time in centuries, the Indian people were in control of their own destiny.
So, after all that, after this incredible, often turbulent but always creative history, defined by the rise and fall of so many powerful empires, you're left with one big question, aren't you? What comes next? What will the people of India build on this foundation of millennia? Well, that's a story that's still being written.